There are moments when your mind becomes a quiet room filled with echoes, and no matter how far you walk in life, one thought keeps returning like it knows the way better than you do. It is not always a person you miss, it is sometimes a feeling, a memory, a version of yourself that once existed beside them. And you begin to wonder why some presences refuse to leave your inner world, even when life has clearly moved on. Tonight, we step into that mystery together, not to fight it, but to understand what it is trying to teach your heart in silence. What keeps a person alive in your thoughts is often not their presence, but the silence they left behind. It is the words that were never spoken, the explanations that were never given, the apologies that never reached your ears, and the truths that arrived too late to change anything. The mind, in its quiet persistence, becomes a place where those unfinished conversations continue to unfold, as if they are still waiting for a different ending, a softer landing, a moment where everything finally makes sense. You may find yourself revisiting the same moments again and again, not because you are weak, but because something in you is still trying to complete what was left incomplete. The heart does not always understand sudden endings. It searches for meaning in fragments. It gathers broken sentences and tries to form a story that feels whole. And when it cannot find closure in reality, it creates it in memory. That is where the mind begins to speak louder than time itself. There are nights when you replay what you should have said, and mornings when you imagine what they might have meant. You construct dialogues that were never spoken, answers that were never received, and in doing so, you try to restore balance to something that once felt unfinished. But closure is not always found in repetition. Sometimes the mind confuses reflection with resolution, and you end up walking in circles inside your own thoughts, believing that if you think hard enough, clarity will eventually arrive. Yet life rarely offers perfect endings. Some conversations are left open not because you were meant to suffer, but because you were meant to learn how to carry unanswered questions without letting them define your peace. There is a quiet strength in accepting that not every story will explain itself fully, not every person will give you the understanding you seek, and not every chapter will close with mutual understanding. Some doors remain half open not to keep you trapped, but to remind you that you are allowed to walk forward even without full answers. And still, the heart resists. It holds on to what was left unsaid because silence can feel heavier than words. But over time, if you listen closely, you begin to notice something gentle beneath the noise of memory. The conversations in your mind slowly lose their urgency. The questions that once demanded answers begin to soften, and what once felt like confusion starts to turn into acceptance, not because everything was explained, but because you finally understand that peace does not always require explanation. One day, you realize that the unfinished conversations were not meant to be completed with them at all. They were meant to be completed within you. There are connections that do not obey the rules of time. They do not ask permission from distance, nor do they dissolve simply because circumstances have changed. Some bonds are felt so deeply that they seem to leave an imprint not only on your memory, but on the quiet rhythm of your thoughts. Even when life carries you forward, something within you still recognizes their presence, as if a part of your inner world remembers them before your mind even has the chance to question it. It is not always about how long someone stayed in your life, but how intensely they were felt while they were there. A brief encounter, a short chapter, a passing season can sometimes echo longer in the heart than years of familiarity. That is because emotional depth does not measure time the way the world does. It measures impact, meaning, and the way someone made you feel seen, understood, or even deeply challenged. And so even in their absence, the connection does not always end. It transforms. It becomes quieter, less visible, but still present in subtle ways. A certain song can bring them back. A familiar place can stir their memory. A random moment of silence can open a door you thought was closed. Not because they are physically connected to your present, but because they once became emotionally woven into your inner landscape. The mind often tries to explain this by saying it is attachment or habit, but the heart knows it is something more layered. It is the echo of emotional energy that was once shared so sincerely that it does not simply vanish when the story changes. It lingers in the spaces between thoughts, in the pauses of daily life, in the moments when everything is still and there is nothing left to distract you from remembering. Yet, what feels like a burden is often also a reflection of how deeply you are capable of feeling. To carry someone in your thoughts is not always a sign that you are stuck, but sometimes a reminder that you are human in the most profound way, able to be moved, shaped, and touched by another soul, even if only for a season. But over time, something begins to shift. The intensity does not disappear all at once. It softens slowly, like a tide retreating from the shore. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel familiar. What once interrupted your peace begins to sit beside it without disturbance, and you start to realize that the bond does not need to be erased in order for you to move forward. Because some connections are not meant to be forgotten, they are meant to be understood, released, and carried differently. Not as an open wound, but as a quiet reminder that you were capable of feeling something real, something deep, something that once mattered enough to leave an echo in your mind long after the moment had passed. Some people do not remain in your life in the way their presence once suggested, but they remain in a deeper, quieter place where memory and emotion intertwine. It is not always their words that stay with you, nor their actions in isolation, but the way they made certain parts of you feel alive, questioned, or even awakened. That is how emotional imprints are formed, not through repetition, but through intensity. A single moment, if felt deeply enough, can echo longer than years of ordinary experience. You may not always realize it in the beginning. Life continues, days pass, and time gives the illusion of movement forward. Yet, within that movement, something subtle lingers. A thought appears without invitation. A memory rises without effort. It is not forced, and yet it returns with a familiarity that feels almost like a presence rather than a recollection. This is how emotional imprints quietly reveal themselves. They do not announce their existence, they simply persist. What stays is often not the person exactly as they were, but the meaning you attached to them while they were in your life. The way they made you question yourself, the way they made you feel understood or misunderstood, the way they touched something unspoken within you. These experiences settle into your emotional memory, becoming part of how you interpret connection, love, distance, and even silence itself. And because of that, letting go is rarely about forgetting. It is about learning how to separate what happened from what it awakened in you. The mind may try to erase, but the heart remembers through feeling, not facts. That is why certain memories return even when you believe you have moved beyond them. They are not returning to pull you backward. They are returning because they were once deeply lived, and deeply lived experiences do not vanish easily. Over time, however, something begins to change. The emotional weight that once came with those thoughts slowly softens. You still remember, but the memory no longer holds the same power over your present. It becomes less of an interruption and more of a quiet recognition. You no longer search for meaning in every echo because you begin to understand that not everything that stays in your mind is meant to stay in your life. There is a kind of maturity that comes when you stop resisting these imprints and start acknowledging them as part of your emotional journey. They are not signs of weakness, nor are they signs that you are still lost in the past. They are evidence that you have felt deeply, that you have connected sincerely, and that you have experienced something real enough to leave a trace within you. And slowly, without force, you begin to carry those imprints differently. not as open questions, not as unfinished stories, but as quiet reminders of how deeply the human heart is capable of feeling, and how even what once felt permanent in thought can eventually become gentle enough to live beside your peace rather than disturb it. The mind has a gentle way of editing the past, not out of dishonesty, but out of longing. It does not always replay the full story as it was lived. Instead, it highlights certain moments, softens certain edges, and brings forward the parts that once felt most alive. In doing so, it creates a version of the past that feels warmer, clearer, and more meaningful than perhaps it truly was in its entirety. This is how idealization quietly begins, not as a deliberate choice, but as a natural response to memory shaped by emotion. You do not always notice it happening. A person becomes more than who they were, a moment becomes more significant than what it originally contained, and a chapter of life begins to glow with a light that was not always present while it was unfolding. The mind has a way of returning to laughter while forgetting the silence that followed it, of remembering connection while softening the distance that also existed within it. It is not deception, it is emotional emphasis, where the heart selects what it wishes to preserve most vividly. And so, when someone stays on your mind, it is often not the full truth of them that you are holding on to, but a carefully preserved collection of the moments that made you feel most understood, most seen, or most alive. The rest, the misunderstandings, the uncertainties, the ordinary struggles, tend to fade into the background of memory. What remains in the foreground is often the most beautiful version of what once was. This is why letting go can feel confusing. You are not always releasing a person as they truly were, but releasing an idea that your mind has gently shaped over time. And that idea can feel very real, even more real than the present moment you are living in. It can sit beside you in silence, influence your thoughts, and quietly shape how you compare your present to what once existed only in memory. But with time, reflection begins to bring balance. You start to remember not just the light, but also the shadows that once accompanied it, not to diminish what you felt, but to understand it more fully. The mind slowly learns to widen its lens, to see the full picture rather than only the softened highlights. And in that widening, something important begins to happen. You start to separate emotional truth from emotional idealization. You realize that what you miss is not always the complete reality of a person or a moment, but the feeling you experienced during certain parts of it. And feelings, as powerful as they are not meant to be lived in permanently. They are meant to be experienced, understood, and eventually released in their full form. And when that understanding settles within you, the memory does not disappear. It simply changes its shape. It becomes less of a place you return to for comfort and more of a quiet reminder of how the mind can beautifully and sometimes gently, misleadingly, preserve what once mattered most. What often keeps someone alive in your thoughts is not their full reality, but the way they once met a need inside you that you may not have fully understood at the time. It could have been the need to feel seen, to feel chosen, to feel safe, or simply to feel that you mattered in a world that often moves too fast to notice the quiet parts of a person. And when someone touches that place within you, even briefly, the mind remembers it with a depth that is not easily replaced. You do not always recognize those needs while you are living through them. They sit quietly beneath your daily experiences, shaping how you respond, how you connect, and how you hold on. Then someone arrives, and for a moment, they seem to give shape to what was previously unspoken within you. Not always perfectly, not always permanently, but enough to awaken a feeling that had been waiting for acknowledgement. And so the memory of them becomes more than just a recollection of events. It becomes a recollection of how you felt in their presence. The sense of being understood, even briefly, can linger longer than the actual understanding itself. The sense of warmth, even if inconsistent, can echo more loudly than the absence that followed. It is not the person entirely that the mind clings to, but the emotional response they triggered within you. This is where attachment begins to form in a quiet and subtle way. The mind does not always distinguish between the source of a feeling and the feeling itself. It begins to associate that emotional fulfillment with a specific person, even when that fulfillment was incomplete or temporary. And when they are no longer present, the absence feels less like the loss of a person and more like the loss of a feeling you once depended on. Over time, this can create a cycle within your thoughts. You return to memories not just to remember them, but to revisit how they made you feel. The comfort, the attention, the validation, or even the intensity of emotion becomes something your mind replays in moments of quiet. Not because you cannot move forward, but because something within you is still learning how to meet those emotional needs in new and independent ways. But growth begins when you start to see this clearly, when you understand that what you are truly reaching for is not the person themselves, but the feeling of being emotionally fulfilled. That realization does not erase the memory, but it gently separates it from dependence. It allows you to see that what was once given to you externally can also be nurtured internally, slowly, and with patience. And as that understanding deepens, the hold of memory begins to soften. You stop searching for that same feeling in the past and begin to recognize how to create stability within yourself. The mind still remembers, but it no longer reaches in the same way. It observes rather than longs. It reflects rather than depends. And in that shift, the thought of someone no longer feels like an absence you are trying to fill, but like a part of your emotional history that helped you understand what you needed all along. The mind has a quiet loyalty to what once felt familiar, even when that familiarity no longer fits the life you are living today. It does not always ask whether something is good for you in the present. Instead, it often returns to what it once knew, what once felt emotionally recognizable, what once gave shape to your inner world during a different season of your life. Familiarity has a subtle power. It does not need to be perfect to be persuasive. It only needs to feel known. This is how attachment begins to grow beyond experience. You do not always stay connected to someone because of what they are in reality, but because of what they represent in your memory. The mind builds a sense of comfort around repetition, even when that repetition is no longer aligned with your growth. It prefers what it has already understood over what it has yet to explore. And in that preference, attachment slowly takes root. There is a difference between experiencing something fully and becoming attached to the emotional imprint it leaves behind. Experience belongs to the moment. It lives, it unfolds, and it passes. Attachment, however, resists passing. It holds on, revisits, and replays. It does not always respect the natural ending of things. Instead, it tries to preserve what once felt meaningful, even when life has already moved forward without it. And so, you may find yourself thinking of someone, not because they are still part of your present, but because your mind has grown accustomed to their emotional presence, the way they once spoke to you, the way they once made you feel, the way certain moments unfolded between you. These become familiar emotional patterns, and the mind, in its search for continuity, begins to return to them as if they still belong in your current reality. But familiarity is not the same as alignment. Just because something feels known does not mean it continues to serve your growth. The mind can confuse emotional repetition with emotional necessity. It can convince you that what once felt important must still hold the same place, even when your inner world has already begun to change. Over time, however, awareness begins to shift this pattern. You start to recognize that what you are holding on to is not always the person or the experience itself, but the comfort of what was once predictable to your emotions. And that recognition brings a quiet clarity. It allows you to see that growth often requires stepping beyond what feels familiar, even when it still echoes softly in your thoughts. Slowly, attachment begins to loosen its grip, not through force, but through understanding. You begin to accept that not everything familiar is meant to remain close, and not everything that once shaped you is meant to continue shaping your present. Some experiences are meant to guide you for a time, not define you for a lifetime. And in that understanding, the mind learns a new kind of strength, a strength that does not depend on holding on, but on knowing when something has already fulfilled its role in your story. There are certain thoughts that do not leave your mind because they are not meant to simply pass through you. They are meant to teach you something you were not yet ready to understand when the experience first arrived. In that way, a person becomes less of a presence in your present and more of a question your inner world keeps returning to. Not to disturb you, but to guide you towards something deeper that has not yet fully settled within your understanding. You may notice that even long after the moment has ended, your thoughts still circle back to it, not in a straight line, but in fragments, pieces of memory, pieces of emotion, pieces of what you felt and what you now wish you had understood differently. It is as if your mind is carefully revisiting the same lesson from different angles, hoping that each return will reveal something that was hidden before. What often keeps someone alive in your thoughts is not just who they were, but what they awakened in you. They may have reflected parts of your own emotional landscape that you had not fully explored. Perhaps they revealed where you overgave, where you held back, where you hoped too much, or where you ignored your own inner voice. And because those realizations were not fully understood in the moment, the mind continues to revisit them, trying to complete what was only partially seen. This is why certain memories feel persistent. They are not random. They are tied to emotional lessons that have not yet fully integrated into your understanding of yourself. And until that understanding becomes clear, the mind will continue to circle back, not as punishment, but as repetition for awareness. It is the way inner growth quietly insists that something still needs your attention. There comes a point, though, when the emotional weight of the memory begins to shift. You stop reacting to it with the same intensity, and instead you start observing it with a different kind of clarity. You begin to see not only what happened, but what it revealed about your patterns, your expectations, and your emotional boundaries. And in that shift, the lesson begins to take shape more clearly than the memory itself. Slowly, what once felt like confusion begins to turn into understanding. You may still remember the person, the moment, or the experience, but it no longer feels like an open wound. It feels more like a chapter that taught you something essential about how you love, how you trust, and how you recognize your own emotional needs. And when that understanding finally settles within you, something quiet happens in your mind. The repetition begins to fade. The thought no longer returns with urgency. It still exists, but it no longer pulls you into the same emotional space, because the lesson has finally been seen, acknowledged, and integrated into who you are becoming. And in that quiet completion, the mind no longer needs to hold on to what it was once trying to understand. There is a quiet conflict that lives within every human heart, a conflict that does not make noise on the outside, yet speaks constantly within. It is the space where understanding and feeling do not move at the same pace, where what you know and what you feel seem to walk in opposite directions. In that space, the mind may arrive at clarity long before the heart is willing to follow. You can understand that something is over, that a chapter has closed, that a person no longer belongs in the present of your life. You can even explain it to yourself with calm reasoning, convincing your thoughts that holding on serves no purpose anymore. And yet, despite all of this understanding, the emotional response does not always agree. It continues to revisit what your mind has already released, as if emotion moves by a different clock, one that does not easily synchronize with logic. This is where the internal struggle quietly begins. The mind tries to move forward in straight lines, while the heart moves in circles. The mind seeks conclusion, but the heart seeks connection. The mind says, "This is finished," while the heart still remembers how it felt when it was not. And between these two voices, you often find yourself standing still, not because you do not know the truth, but because feeling the truth takes longer than recognizing it. What makes this conflict even more tender is that neither side is wrong. The mind is trying to protect your future, to bring structure to your thoughts, to help you release what no longer aligns with your path. The heart, on the other hand, is trying to honor what was once meaningful, to preserve the emotional weight of what was experienced deeply. One is focused on survival, the other on remembrance, and both are simply trying to guide you in their own language. So when someone continues to stay in your thoughts, even when you logically understand that they no longer belong in your life, it is not a contradiction of progress. It is the natural delay between knowing and feeling. Emotional release does not happen in a single moment of realization. It happens gradually as the heart learns to trust what the mind has already accepted. Over time, something gentle begins to happen within this tension. The voice of the mind becomes quieter, not because it is ignored, but because it no longer needs to argue. And the voice of the heart slowly begins to understand that remembering does not have to mean returning. You can hold a memory without reopening a door. You can acknowledge a feeling without allowing it to define your direction. And in that slow alignment, the conflict does not disappear all at once. It softens. The sharp edges between thought and emotion begin to blur. What once felt like internal resistance begins to feel like quiet understanding. You realize that letting go is not a single decision made by logic or emotion alone, but a gradual meeting point where both finally learn to walk in the same direction. There are people who do not simply enter your life, they enter a version of you that did not yet fully exist. When you think back to them, you are not only remembering who they were, but also who you were when they were near you. And sometimes that version of yourself feels so distinct, so emotionally vivid, that it becomes inseparable from the memory of the person themselves. You do not just recall an individual, you recall a period of becoming. This is how identity quietly intertwines with memory. A certain time in your life begins to feel defined by someone's presence, even if they were not responsible for your entire transformation. They may have simply been there during a phase where you were learning, growing, questioning, or breaking open in ways you had not experienced before. And because of that timing, your mind begins to link them with that version of yourself, as if they are part of the same emotional story. So when they are no longer present, it is not only their absence you feel, it is also the distance from who you were when you were with them. That earlier version of you still exists in memory, still carries certain emotions, still responds to certain thoughts in ways your present self may no longer fully relate to. And yet, your mind returns to it because it was a time when certain feelings felt more immediate, more intense, more defining. This is why some people stay in your thoughts long after they are gone from your life. It is not only about attachment to them, but also attachment to a part of yourself that was shaped during that time. The mind remembers how you spoke differently, how you trusted differently, how you hoped differently. It remembers the emotional posture you carried when you were still becoming, still unfolding, still learning how to navigate connection. And as life continues, you change. Your understanding deepens, your boundaries strengthen, your perspective shifts. But the memory of that earlier self does not disappear. It sits quietly within you, often awakened by reminders of the person who once shared that chapter of your life. And when it is awakened, it can feel as though the past is calling, when in truth, it is only the echo of who you used to be. There is a gentle realization that arrives with time, though. You begin to understand that you are not meant to return to that version of yourself, even if it feels familiar or emotionally charged. Growth does not move backward to reclaim old identities. It moves forward while carrying their lessons. The person you were then was necessary, but not permanent. And so, the presence of that person in your thoughts slowly transforms. They are no longer a doorway back into who you were, but a reminder of how far you have come. The emotional weight begins to shift from longing to recognition. You no longer seek to relive that time, but to understand it as part of your unfolding. And in that understanding, identity and memory separate gently. You remain who you have become while still honoring who you once were. There is also something deeply human in the repetition itself. The mind returns to what mattered because it is still learning how to release meaning without losing significance. It does not want to forget what shaped you. It wants to understand how to carry it differently. And in that process, it may circle the same emotional ground many times before it finally finds a place of rest. Over time, the repetition begins to soften, not because the memory has vanished, but because it no longer demands the same emotional response. You can remember without reopening the wound. You can recall without being pulled back into it. And that is where healing quietly reveals itself, not as absence of thought, but as a change in how thought lives within you. And in that change, what once felt like struggle becomes something closer to understanding, and what once felt like pain becomes part of a deeper inner stability that no longer needs to prove it has moved on.